When going back to look at Doom from 1993, it might be hard to appreciate what it achieved with a modern eye without the context of the contemporary gaming landscape. 3D gaming on home console and PC was still rudimentary and in its infancy in 1993. Player controls were often quite clunky and unresponsive in those games that had 3D graphics, and aspects of the 3D rendering were quite coarse. Polygons could either be unstable and wobbly when the camera moved, making the world seem like it would fall apart, or the graphics could be simply shaded and flat without texture or surface information. And world elements could draw in very obviously in the mid to short distance. Games were using 3D, but 3D worlds were held together loosely and lacked consistency and solidity, and if they were more complex, they tended to be slow. And I mean slow by 1993 standards. With modern standards for frame rate, we would probably classify some of these consumer home experiences with words like unplayable. 3D accelerators like the 3DFX Voodoo were still more than 2 years away, and there was no semblance of a standardized way to accelerate and render 3D graphics. As a result, it was unsurprising that these compromises were there and consumers lived with them. 3D PC games were still rendering on CPUs, and general-purpose x86 processors were not designed around that task, and they had double duty. They would render the game and process the gameplay code at the same time. When you place these type of earlier experiences side by side with Doom, I think you can more easily appreciate why Doom in 1993 could seem revolutionary in comparison to people who experienced it back then. Doom was comparatively fast, it controlled responsively and intuitively with great feedback, and it had an incredible level of detail and solidity in its game world. Its 3D surfaces were not constantly jittering or wobbling at their seams like you could find in other games. Doom also had many uncommon and complex visual features in its game world, which gave it its realistic look. It had detailed and varying textures on its walls, floors, and ceilings, of which the latter two were not common at the time in first-person games. It also had ceilings of variable height, so areas could look more complex than just corridor mazes seen in other games. And more importantly, the third dimension of height was not just a visual flourish. By using stairs or lifts, the player could go up to elevated platforms and look down on the levels below. Perhaps Doom's biggest visual differentiator, though, was its emulation of lighting. When you are in a more confined space in Doom, it's easy to notice that things further away get darker in the distance. The walls, the floors, and ceilings take on darker color values the further away they are from the player. This diminished lighting, as it is called, defined the game's moody look and was further enhanced by sector lighting. Here, artists could draw lines over the level geometry and define the brightness of that area and apply fades, flickers, and tie game logic to the brightness level. It leads to classic moments where the lights go out, change, or where you can see ultra-sharp and defined shadows from the level geometry. This isn't being simulated, mind you, but it's artist-drawn. The cumulative effect of all these visual flourishes on top of the high-resolution sprites was a game that was atmospheric, polished, and solid. And to make it look so good and run in real time, it required new techniques. For earlier first-person games like Wolfenstein 3D, they were typically done with ray casting, sending out a ray in screen space till it hit a 2D mapped coordinate and then drawing perspective correct strips of wall with a fixed height at the spot, potentially with mapped textures. Floors and ceilings were solid colors and an illusion, more or less. This was state-of-the-art for first-person games. Getting more complex graphics with real ceilings and floors with varying heights and textures, while all having it run fast would be a challenge. Games like Ultima Underworld from 1 year prior to Doom did attempt it, but CPUs of that day limited its execution. Draw distance was capped very close to the camera, performance wasn't the best, the screen was small, and the surfaces wobbled unstably when the camera moved. With Doom, an entirely different approach was needed to get a similar look to this, but with better performance, stability, and draw distance. Instead of ray casting like in previous games by id, Doom uses binary space partition or BSP rendering where visibility, the things you can see, is dictated by a pre-calculated process. When a map is made, an offline calculation is done for any given point of the map. The map is split up into sectors and mapped out into a tree where visibility of adjacent and distant sectors is determined from the sector you're in. As the player runs through a level in first person, the sector they are in and their field of view determines which other sectors are drawn. Visibility is essentially computed beforehand so that a lot of the level is not rendered when it isn't seen. Walls are then rendered as strips, and the ceilings and floors are rendered as flats or viz planes, both with textures and sprites are then superimposed over this and perspective scaled based upon the sector they are in the BSP. This BSP rendering gave Doom its incredible speed, its ability to have lights, and its consistency where stuff just didn't jiggle or wobble around when the camera moved. But it had its limitations. Things do exist in 3 dimensions with height, but the way walls are rendered breaks if the camera is not looking parallel to the ground, causing a visual distortion if the camera was unlocked. Likewise, rooms could not be placed over other rooms and slopes weren't possible. The 3D was there, of course, and it was fast, but it had limitations due to the way rendering was being done. So how did it run though? Well, the top CPU at the time of Doom's release in December of 1993 was technically the original P5 Pentium, but due to an insanely high price and compatibility issues, it was not yet a viable mainstream computing platform. So instead, the real de facto highest-end hardware around Doom's launch was Intel's i486DX2, and specifically the 66 MHz model, which was released in the last quarter of 1992. With a CPU like that, it is easy to see how, in spite of Doom's incredible optimization feats, that it was still a huge challenge for mainstream modern computing. Now, the model of DX266 I have is slightly below the highest end configuration that you could have around Doom's initial release date. Mine is using a fast VESA local bus video card, but it only has 128K of L2 cache instead of the highest end 256K. Looking at benchmarks from the time, my 486DX2 scores slightly below the fastest right-through cache DX266s of that time period, so it scores a little bit lower in FPS than the top end, but it still represents the cream of the crop, a PC that would have easily cost well over $2,000 back in 1993, or around $4,500 in today's money. PC gaming was still incredibly expensive back in 1993. So how did an incredibly expensive PC play Doom? Well, looking at the full screen performance, it is faster than many other 3D games for sure, but performance is temperamental and very scene dependent. Doom runs at 70 Hz and ticks the game at half that frame rate, so it has a 35 FPS limit in modern parlance, and a 486DX266 is only really hitting a nice 35 FPS in full screen graphics mode when in the most confined of spaces. Typical combat in moderately detailed views tends to be between 22 and 28 FPS, and the longest and most complex views found in episode 1 or 2 or 3 can even dip into the upper teens at worst. Doom was faster than the rest, but at full screen, even my competently benchmarking 486DX266 is struggling by modern frame rate standards. But by the standards of 1993, where many 3D games ran quite a lot worse or had tiny little 3D viewports, this was a much more fluid and immersive experience than what many had seen before. And to get that level of immersion, you really could only be running a top-of-the-line PC from 1992 or 1993. If you had an older or lower-end 486, for example one without cache or at 33 MHz, you could easily be seeing half the frame rate or less than I'm showing here. And a CPU wasn't the only thing you needed. You needed to have a VESA local bus video card. The VLB standard was only introduced in 1992, 1 year before Doom's release, and an ISA video card does not mix well with Doom's fast drawing. Even with a good CPU, an ISA video card will run this game at a pitiful frame rate in full screen, even if the CPU could technically muster so much more. Essentially, unless you had a top-end and expensive PC for 1993 standards, Doom's full screen experience was going to be a slideshow. And even then, a DX266 is not exactly performing incredibly well by 2025 standards. So what recourse did a user have to play this game on a lower end kit or with faster frame rates? Well, you could elect to play the game not in full screen mode. Doom allows you to adjust the resolution of the gameplay by decreasing the viewport size, keeping the HUD map to the bottom, and the gameplay rendering resolution decreases as screen size goes down. In fact, Doom's starting viewport size is one down from a full unobstructed view, so per default, Doom actually has a border, presumably made default for performance reasons in 1993. Doom also has a low quality graphics mode, which keeps the view size the same but doubles their rendered pixel width along the x-axis, making the game look chunkier. With options like these, the player could increase their fluidity of the game. The default window size over the full screen size, for example, increases performance by a useful 10%, which is quite meaningful when performance is as low as it is here. Sure, some of the gun and environment is cut off, but this was a sensible optimization, and it makes sense why id shipped the game rendering this way by default. The low detail setting is perhaps the best though for a performance win. Yes, the game is noticeably chunkier, but it performs more than 31% better than the full screen presentation and is quite often hitting that 35 FPS VSync line. It feels a lot smoother and looks a lot smoother, even though it is of course not perfect. And that was essentially the extent to which people could improve their performance in Doom within the release timeframe. Generally, people just put up with performance as it was, and were happy to see such a good-looking 3D world running as well as it did. For modern standards though, the best place to play Doom, the way it was meant to be played, was years later down the line with a Pentium-based PC, or one of the later highly clocked 486 models. Something like the lowest end 133 MHz Pentium on Socket 7 from 2 years later runs Doom 1 at full speed essentially the entire time, with none of the hotspots dropping performance like we see on the DX2. And that Pentium level of performance would prove itself invaluable when Doom 2 released. Doom 2 is a sequel in the most classic way possible. It is the first game, but bigger. The technological underpinnings are essentially the same, but the levels and gameplay ambition are greater. Levels are much larger, and at times they have many more complex overlapping segments. Along with the maps being larger, especially in the middle part of the game, the enemies are found in greater abundance. With Doom 2 releasing in late 1994, the now 2-year-old 486 DX266 could run the smaller levels of Doom 2 well enough, but even while utilizing the smaller default window size, it's plain as day to see that the performance has depressed over the first game on the same hardware. And those larger levels found in the middle of the game, yeah, those run especially poorly, dipping at their worst into the low teens in some views, with all the enemies populating the streets below and the city skyline above. Even the heaviest areas of Doom 1 do not run this poorly. A more modern Pentium though, that runs these areas a lot better, keeping up to that 35 FPS line and being smooth. And thus, the best place to play Doom was on a future machine. The game pushed graphical technology so much on PC that it scaled really well after its release, running better the better your hardware got years later. It having ultra-demanding spec requirements for its fluid frame rates meant that PCs, even the high-end ones, in 1993 really couldn't play Doom to modern frame rate standards. Thankfully, the rapid advancement of processor technology made Doom run at full frame rate and full resolution just in a few years' time, and we have since then had gigantic leaps in processing power to the point now where Doom, a game which once made PCs tremble in fear, now runs on nearly everything. Not too long after Doom's release, we already started seeing Doom being brought over to portable machines, which was unthinkable just a few years earlier, like the Game Boy Advance, which managed to play both Doom 1 and Doom 2 surprisingly well, given how it is a turn of the Millennium device that runs on just 2 AA batteries. Years pass and powerful chips start finding their way into the places you least expect. 10 years ago, Doom is already running at full speed on ATM machines, with the pin numpad taking the place of the keyboard. Honestly, this one's pretty amazing. I would definitely play it. Doom not only runs anywhere, but it also displays anywhere. An oscilloscope with a built-in crosshair? Yeah, that works. Doom is so lightweight for modern computers that people have been rendering it in ever increasingly inefficient ways. Manually updating rows and columns of a Google spreadsheet to use it as a display device? It does run at a glacial 3 seconds per frame, but hey, it's unmistakably Doom. My personal favorite and least efficient way to display Doom has to be Doom running on Windows Task Manager. Here we see 896 CPU cores in a task manager setting where the artificially induced processor load causes the various cells to darken and lighten. Monochromatic low res and a stupidly expensive power bill, but this is Doom, gosh darn it. Doom and Doom 2's 90s tech is now charmingly quaint when we see it running like this, but the next Doom title that id would put out would be magnitudes heavier.